Chinese influence operations in Japan. Adorably Inept? Devin Stewart, senior fellow at the Carnegie Council and author of the recent report, China's Influence in Japan. Everywhere, yet nowhere in particular, seems to think so. In this show, we'll talk about China's tactics in Japan, what makes Japanese society uniquely resistant to the CCP's charms, and what lessons can be learned from Japan's experience inoculating themselves from CCP influence. Devin, welcome to ChinaTalk.
We were thinking about how do you look at the way targeted countries digest or interact with countries that are using influence operations. So you'd think, given more than a 2,000-year history with so much baggage and such an intense bilateral relationship, that getting people to open up in Japan, especially such a polite society, might be a challenge. I went all over Japan. I talked to 40 people over the course of 2 trips over 2 years. And getting people to open up was surprisingly easy, and they're even somewhat prideful. They have a lot of experience with dealing with China. So their attitude is basically, welcome to Japan, you American, you non-Japanese person. You're a beginner in dealing with China compared to us. Almost all of them were like, look, we're too smart for foreigners, especially China, this country that we've been dealing with. And it reminded me a little bit of going to Hanoi, the sort of attitude of, we've been dealing with these guys a long time and we know a thing or two. In fact, we should teach you how to deal with them if you even need some tips in the future. And they even went so far as to go on these long soliloquies of what a failure Chinese influence operations are in Japan.
It's interesting thinking back to the sort of rise and fall of CCP, in particular influence operations, where you look at the 1930s and 40s and they're winning over like hook, line, and sinker all of these American journalists who are then able to write books and produce reports which convince the world that Chiang Kai-shek is the bad guy and Mao's the good guy, and he's the future of Jeffersonian democracy in China. And throughout the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, the dynamic, like the narrative was different, but it was still a very compelling one, which is that we are the vanguard of the global revolution. And even in Japan, it had some takers of hard leftists who found like solace in what was going on in China. But as the regime has evolved into something frankly less compelling and more, certainly there are Maoist China, if people knew what was going on, probably would have been just as uncompelling. But the sort of what you're aspiring to, if you want to be like China, isn't something that necessarily from an ideological perspective has a lot of appeal in at least first world democracy. So let's go through some of the sorry tactics, which I guess the CCP is trying. Let's do 3 in 1 stroke. COVID, Confucius Institutes, and newspapers. What's going on with those efforts?
COVID was happening in the background when we were writing this report, where we had done all of the field work already. So we had to put some of these parts back, put it in on the fly.
Yeah.
The COVID aspect was, what's going on there is, from Japan's perspective, the influence is to put on a friendly face toward China, right? So Japan's influence toward China is to say, we're with you, we're neighbors, because the media and the government in China are essentially on the same page, to say the least. The media and the government, and therefore a lot of the public opinion, are in sync. So the COVID case showed this. In terms of the other way around, at the time, the Shinzo Abe administration wanted to, for business reasons and for practical reasons, very pragmatic reasons, wanted to foster good economic ties with China. They still do under Suga. Japan wanted to do this, what they call the tactical détente, which is to bury the hatchet between China and Japan and just say, look, let's grow rich together in a sense. But the people in the media aren't buying it. And what I found was that there is a bias in Japan, and it's anti-China. And so when the newspapers are writing articles, they have an interest in Japan they have a profit motive in Japan to write negative stories about China because people want it. So even if the government is trying to foster a good relationship, the people in the media aren't going to be singing from the same page. So the COVID episode really demonstrated that while Shinzo Abe and Xi Jinping were doing nice gestures on an international stage and the Chinese media was playing along, back in Japan, people on Twitter or articles, op-eds, columns, Just people are just like, you got to be kidding me. This is like amateur hour here. They can't, the Chinese can't just buy our friendship with some masks or with ventilators or something. So that was that one. That really covers media and COVID. And the third one was, you mentioned Confucius Institutes, which, like the calligraphy story that you had mentioned earlier, is an example of where it's, again, inept or maybe old-fashioned. And I think it was Hu Jintao, but a number of Chinese officials over the years. There was a Chinese ambassador to Japan as well. And I think also Xi Jinping might have mentioned this too, that it's befuddlement of like, why can't our influence operations do a better job in Japan? Why aren't they sticking? Because they are being created in an environment of authoritarian, anti-democratic, closed society.
Sure.
And so the soft power element is limited for China. And in Japan, there's this built-in bias of 2,000 years of being a kind of skeptical of one another.
My favorite anecdote you had from the report was a scholar talking to you about what the typical like Zhong'er Youhao, like the friendship organization activity is. And they did a cooking demo or a calligraphy thing, but the quote was, "I have been interested in these activities, but I see little Chinese soft power. It's much different from the Japan-Taiwan exchanges, which are actually fun. And they have interesting events, and they show movies, and they have authors come in or whatever.
Yeah.
But the Chinese, like the mainland Chinese centers, are less attractive to Japanese, especially to young people." Another scholar told you that the friendship associations were, quote, "useless because Chinese political warfare suffers from a, quote, unsophisticated Middle Kingdom mentality, that they're dated, uninfluential, old fashions, and ineffective since Japanese do not want to be suckers to Chinese political influence."
Yes.
We're too cool.
We're cool.
We're too cool for this.
Too cool for school.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't want to be chumps. The Japanese don't want to be chumps. And, the Japanese, I know much more about Japan than I do about China. And I would say that being cool is a preoccupation in Tokyo. As most of the West,
Sure.
we all want to be cool. And
There's nothing remotely cool about.
they don't want to be duped. And meanwhile, it's fun. And if you've been anywhere in the world, anywhere, including America, you know that the country next door is the funniest country to make fun of. So in Japan, it happens to be China. In America, it happens to be Mexico and Canada. How many Mexico and Canada jokes do we have? We have a lot.
Sure.
We don't dislike those two countries, but they're our neighbors, so we're going to make fun of them.
Yeah.
That's just how it works.
So there are a handful of examples of hard power, of corruption that has been exposed.
Yeah, you could call it malign influence.
Sure. You want to walk through, who do we have? Akimoto.
So Akimoto is great. They should make a movie about that one. It was basically, you have all the ingredients of an Ocean's 11 or something. What happened was basically the minister, Akimoto, who had responsibilities for integrated resorts, IR, not international relations, but integrated resorts. Fancy way of saying casino. They are casinos that are dressed up to be palatable to the public. So they include aspects that are not casino. There's a hotel or a restaurant or other things to water down the gambling aspect of it, make it not so focused.
Yeah. Of course, because there's pachinko parlors on every corner in every city. You got to draw the line somewhere. My favorite Asia, the other great Asia gambling story is, of course, in Singapore, where finally Lee Kuan Yew basically for 50 years said, we're not doing casinos. This is bad for the country. Right. It's not good. He finally leaves the stage. And within 2 or 3 years, the subsequent prime minister is like, this is crazy. We have to do this. We're losing Chinese tourists to other places in the world. And this is like an opportunity we can't pass up. But the court of sop to Lee Kuan Yew personally, as well as just like that mindset, is that they have a fee where you have to pay $150 if you're a Singaporean national to enter the Marina Sands basement. And there's also, it's very straightforward. If you're someone's relative, you can put a block on them and then they're never allowed to enter, which I just think is like a nice little way to make sure you're making money off the Chinese tourists while not polluting your national character or what have you with too many gambling acts.
Cultural pollution, very controversial. So Akimoto was a politician, and he essentially was in charge of the casinos there. in Japan. And he basically took a very small bribe from a company that had an affiliation with, I think it was Jinhua Holdings. That holding company owns a majority stake of the company that was called 500.com. And 500.com is a Chinese gambling company that was looking for new opportunities outside of China because things were getting difficult in the domestic market. So looking for other avenues. And they presented this is why it was a bad movie, because the bribe was presented to Akimoto in the fashion of an old like samurai movie, like an old 1970s samurai movie where it was like it was like a cliche. When you give a bribe to someone in samurai days on the silver screen, you do it underneath like cookies or cakes or something in a box. And so they followed that script.
So the Chinese watched enough Japanese movies to know that we do it under cookies.
That's how it was delivered to them. And I actually found some examples from Japanese cinema to show exactly what they were talking about. It was great. I have to say, like, it was something like $30,000, I believe, US dollars. You have to feel bad that, geez.
Speaking of low amounts of Chinese bribes, if you go through we were speaking before the show about the Chinese communist espionage book by Peter Madison, Matthew Brazil wrote. And one of the striking things to me in that book is basically it's an anthology of every instance of Chinese espionage that's in the public domain. And there are a handful of these Chinese nationals in the US who have been caught, and they got $2,000, $3,000 for taking some camera on a plane with them, which is some night vision fancy thing. Ugh. It's really stingy.
Terrible.
Yeah, it's almost like the least sophisticated.
That's right.
Yeah, like the guy on the plane carrying the camera is the most straightforward thing to catch.
Right. I'm making a bit of an illusion here and snaking around because the title of this report is Chinese Influences Everywhere and Nowhere in Particular. One of my off-the-record sort of questions to people was, maybe it is here, but no one's talking about it. And I think despite people's posture and argument that Chinese influence wasn't working very well in Japan, it's possible that there's a lot more there that we just don't see. Yeah. Which was, in Japan, things are well hidden, or the Japanese are very good at hiding things. Yeah. It almost sounds racist. It almost sounds like a racist trope, like they're a bunch of ninjas or something. Yeah. It's terrible. But the Japanese interviewees were telling me this, that you have to understand that in Japan, things aren't exactly what they seem. There's probably a lot of other stuff going on here. And then I'll go, at the end of the interview, I'll be like, so do you think that despite all this nice story that you told me about, things are very clean? Maybe there's stuff happening that is not reported on, not talked about. And people will be like, maybe. And that would be the end of the conversation.
Sure.
Have a nice day.
Yeah. So let's come to our second example, Iwatani.
Iwatani is a well-respected professor in Hokkaido University, and he was invited over to Beijing to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, doing some research. He's a historian doing some historical research. So the 2014 law in China that was very liberal, shall we say, a liberal use of how people can be charged with intelligence matters or collecting intelligence, basically charged as being spies. And Iwatani was there getting some historical data and charged on this invitation from CAS, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Seemed very strange that the authorities knew his whereabouts, knew what he was doing, and yet he was charged as a spy. This created a big uproar in Japan. And the uproar actually took place during my visit in December 2019, because Iwatani is like buddies with all these people in Japan who are essentially what you might call the club of Japanese scholars who are sympathetic toward China because they like the subject that they study, right? That's a thing that human beings have around the world, is that when you study something, you have a lot of times you have a little bit more affinity toward it. You know what I mean?
Sure. I'm sure there are also people who know a lot about China and Japan who aren't super fans of China. But
it doesn't always happen.
yeah.
But say like,
there's a whole history in the U.S. as well of like the China hands and the Japan hands.
Right.
This is
Right.
what was that? Wasn't there like a funny name for it, like the chrysanthemum something?
Chrysanthemum Club.
The Chrysanthemum Club. Yeah,
Yes.
that they called like the foreign service officers in the
That's right.
30s that didn't really have problems with Japanese imperialism.
Right. And the famous Chrysanthemum and the Sword book. And then Chalmers Johnson's Chrysanthemum Club, I think that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
Is the revisionists. Anyway, it was basically their friend Iwatani, who was over there in China, and they felt betrayed. These Japanese scholars felt betrayed. And his arrest created a big controversy because it was like, I thought we're on good terms here with China. And this guy's one of our friends, he's on our side. And they wrote like a public letter condemning China. And it was something like beyond imagination. This act against Japan is beyond our imagination. So again, it's another example of not doing a very good job of being sophisticated in your influence operation, because it backfired. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest themes in the report is ham-fisted, sort of stumbling around, doing things that are seen as bullying and heavy-handed, and that ends up backfiring or just playing into the biases of the Japanese to begin with.
Sure. It's the same with the NBA. And the NBA is a bit of a different story. We just did a show last week about it because it was much more aimed at a domestic audience of trying to rile people up about Hong Kong back when the protests were still very much in force than it was about thinking that shutting up Daryl Morey would improve perceptions of China in the US, which maybe someone thought that, but that would have been a huge and like really embarrassing misread. But for the stuff that's clearly directly focused on overseas influence, it's often that you see these big misunderstandings and missteps on the part of the Confucius Institutes and the United Fronts of the world. You mentioned earlier that there are aspects of Japanese society which seem to be particularly resilient to Chinese influence operations. Maybe let's first start talking about how Japanese public opinion towards China has changed over time. My understanding is that after Gaiga Kaifang, after reform and opening, there was actually like a big sense of guilt and of what the Japanese army did to China in the 30s and 40s. And there was enormous, JETRO was spending billions and billions of dollars, and there was all of this sort of technology transfer, which like they weren't even worried about because they felt bad about it. And of course, I'm sure there was a capitalist motive to this investment as well. But I found it really remarkable that the polling numbers of Japanese opinion towards Chinese pre Tiananmen Square were up in the high 70s of approval of just positive feelings towards China, which dropped pretty precipitously after June 4th. Maybe pick up the story there and talk a little bit about how broader Japanese perception has changed.
I would say Tiananmen and the Senkaku disputes in the 2000s were the two sharpest drivers of negative perception by Japanese of China. So the poll, if you were to draw a line on an average, it was pretty much like a linear slope going down since the 70s.
But basically, we have these big drops of 20 points each going in 1989 from about 70% favorable sentiment towards China down to 50. And then in 2009, I think we're at like 40% favorability. So there was a sort of like slow but steady decline. And until the Senkakus, which started in 2012, and then we made it down to the 20% favorability.
A couple of people told me that it was also due to the longer you know China as a Japanese person, the more you dislike China, which is a really hard thing to swallow, so to speak. Like, you would think that most things are the other way around, but their perspective is that Chinese have betrayed the true socialist spirit by becoming these raging capitalists and money hungry and free market and Wild West, and that the Japanese leftist socialists are more true to the tradition. Some people argue that socialism is much more thriving in Japan compared to China, and that protecting things like lifetime employment or things like universal health care or things like ruthless competition between and disruption between companies and banks and so forth less disruption in the economy, more managed. And I think, yeah, a few Japanese, and if you're in the academy in Japan, by definition, you're probably pretty left of center compared to the rest of the population. That's actually an important point, because this came up as well, is that these Confucius institutes are with universities where the sentiment in universities are out of whack with the rest of the society. So that Japanese society is, as a whole, quite skeptical of China. But there's sort of a latent sympathy for China in Japanese universities because of this nostalgia for socialism.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah, I feel like that's an easier argument to have made 34 years ago than now. Let's wait till this.
Yeah, some of these things I'm talking about are like dated, but people are still talking about it today.
Talk a little bit about resistance within the Japanese body politic. So start with first like the relative isolation and the political homogeneity of the Japanese body politic and how that influences how Chinese influences operations get received.
So this all goes back to what sometimes is called the Galapagos syndrome, that Japan is like some kind of freaky Galapagos island where it's completely separated from the rest of the world, and that they're these uniquely adapted creatures living on these four big rocks in the Pacific, and that there's not a whole lot of influence from the outside world, that they've adopted their own ecosystem. And so if that's that kind of picture in your mind can help you think about why would a country be able to resist foreign influence or influence operations or malign influence? One has to do with, as you said, political homogeneity and also the relative isolation of the country. In fact, Japan went through famous periods of actual complete isolation, more or less. And that this physical isolation can be like a castle with a moat, like it's protected from outside forces. And then when you get inside the castle, if everyone's singing from the same book, you might not be able to persuade them of something else. That if there's not a whole lot of political competition, if there's political homogeneity, if people are basically accepting the line of the authorities, that it's not going to be a place that's going to be a marketplace of ideas. The interesting thing here is that in terms of resisting influence, Japan has both liberal virtues and liberal deficits. And the virtues are things like it's a very educated population that is well-read, and they know what's going on in the world, and they're sophisticated, and those types of things. And they have pretty high level of voting, for example, compared to the United States or compared to other democracies. But the deficits are the ones that are more interesting, that you'd think that flaws or deficits would be flaws, but they're, in terms of resisting influence, they're actually virtues. So what are they? One of them is they just don't care. If you've been to Japan, what I'm talking about is that there is a implicit assumption that politics is for other people, and that we have more important things to think about here. Our jobs, our families, our going out to eat, getting food, very sort of immediate concerns, healthcare, things like that. But politics is a sort of a foregone conclusion for a lot of people in Japan, and that this sort of detachment or apathy toward politics in Japan is actually a virtue if you're resisting foreign influence. And a Japanese journalist actually asked me, what are you talking about? What do you mean by that? And because it strikes some people as counterintuitive. But what I'm trying to say is that if you don't really care about something a whole lot, you might not be tuned in enough to even be persuaded of one way or another about it, because your attention span's not there.
What about the way the media is set up in Japan? How does that play into all of this?
The media in Japan have been called oligopolistic. It's one way of thinking about it. It's not if you're thinking about the newspapers and radio and TV, they're very big 4 or 5 conglomerates.
Sort of America circa 1960s, if the TV also owned the Washington Post and the...
That's a really interesting comparison, because the act that we had, was it the Fairness Act?
Yeah. So the FCC introduced it in 1989 and it was eliminated in 1987.
So it was introduced when? 49. Yes. Okay. And it was the title of the act, Fairness Doctrine. And that doctrine, I believe, still exists in Japan. And it's still in debate right now. So Abe tried to actually revise the Fairness Act. And there is now a controversy in Japan about whether it's more conducive to free speech and government control of the narrative to have the Fairness Doctrine in place or not in place. Because you can make the argument either way, actually. You could say that if the Fairness Doctrine is in place, which it was in the United States, in our experience as Americans, at least for me growing up in the 70s and 80s, TV seemed pretty balanced. At least the news seemed pretty balanced. It seemed at least less crazy and overly dramatized and sensational.
Sure.
And I guess at least the reputation is that Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather and that era of news reporting was even-handed and just the facts and share both sides of the story. Right? Now it's a circus. And I think the debate in Japan is whether or not it's better to keep that balance enforced or reduce the amount of law so that the government doesn't have a say in what's considered balanced or not. You follow me?
Sure. How does it tie back then to Chinese influence?
So in general, the media environment in Japan, at least, and look, I'm not talking about Twitter. Twitter has a big saturation. Japan happens to be a very big Twitter country. There's Line. There's a bunch of apps that are popular in Japan for communications and social media. But the mainstream old school media is pretty protected and roughly in place. There's no foreign ownership.
So lastly, let's talk a little bit about the reception that this report got in Japan.
It made a pretty big splash in Japan. It actually was on several news TV shows. So number one, Japan was, if I can speak from reading a great deal of media coverage of this report in Japan.
Yeah.
Number one was they were saying, hey, here's an American who cares about Japan.
Oh, Jesus.
Serious. And they're like, that's good.
We're worried about you guys. Yeah.
They're basically saying the first thing we have to get out on the table is there is an American, and therefore there might be other ones who actually care about what's happening in Japan.
And this is a new thing this would raise eyebrows, or how does this sort of?
I would say that's an old thing that's been going around if you talk to any Japan hand, there's always this thing. It's like any other country. When America looks and takes the time to really study something in another country and publish a big report, if that other country usually is going to say, oh, it's cool that America's paying attention to us. Mm-hmm. And so even some of the headlines were America says, China is an influence in Japan, or U.S. think tank says this. Oh my God. Oh,
It's so funny just contrasting this response. The most you can hope for when you write something about China is Remen Erbal or the Global Times will write you up and say mean things, and maybe you'll get a fun new epithet for your Twitter bio. But to actually have a sort of open debate about research you write must be just a very fun thing to witness through the looking glass.
It was actually quite surprising because it was a fairly dry topic when we launched the project, and it came out right during COVID and China's explosion into the imagination of Americans and Japanese. It just happened to have been published right at the most explosive time it could be possibly published. Another thing that the Japanese press was saying was, number one, here's an American who cares about Japan. Number two, this is serious, guys. They're like, oh, China's trying to influence our government.
Yeah.
We better pay attention to this. And that this report is evidence that this is a serious topic and we need to pay more attention.
It's interesting just on that point because you've had countries that have woken up to this in different ways. There's Anne-Marie Brady of New Zealand, who's a New Zealander who wrote on this, who ended up it became like a big national topic. And in Australia, again, it was Australians who brought this to attention. But it's interesting that in Japan's case, the first time this became a topic of national discussion was actually a foreigner bringing it to attention.
That's right. It's called gaiatsu in Japan, right? There's this idea that foreign influence has an impact on things in Japan. It's a cliche now, gaiatsu. But I would say the number three thing was the third point in the press was, let's take a look at these people in our government who are making these decisions, and who are their friends, and how are they making these decisions, and maybe we're too soft on China, and there's a lot of implied rhetoric.
It's interesting because I think we skipped this earlier in the discussion, but Japan, the Japanese public is the most anti-China
public in the world.
Yeah, so Pew recently, I think a few weeks ago, did a global poll of every major country in the world and looking at the population's attitudes towards China. And basically every country, US included, had a 10 or 15 point jump in disapproval from 2019 to 2020. But Japan was like the funniest bar on the graph, because it was like 92% disapproval in 2019 and 93% in 2020.
Right.
So it's interesting that it goes back to your original thesis of this sort of being everywhere and nowhere, that if everyone is anti-China, it's not even a topic of conversation, and no one is thinking and investigating exactly what is going on in the government when it comes to these sorts of dealings.
That's right.
This ties back to a piece I want to close on, which you wrote earlier back in January, pre-COVID, entitled "The Risks to the Japan-China Tactical Détente." In the subsequent year, a ton has happened to make that argument almost a less novel one than it was back in January. I'm curious where you see the potential scenarios for the relationship going over the next few years, particularly with the new government.
So Suga just visited Hanoi and continued along the efforts to diversify Japanese manufacturing capacities and capabilities outside of China into other countries, in this case, Southeast Asia, ASEAN. This is a part of the whole story about COVID and anxieties around COVID and distrust in China, and whether it's the right strategy to depend on China for your supply chain. I think what's going to happen with Suga is a continuation of Shinzo Abe's approach to China, which is on one hand pragmatic, looking for opportunities, areas of possible cooperation and mutual benefit, but on the other hand, looking for ways to hedge and mitigate risk that China poses to Japan's society and its economy and its politics. And that's why Americans and other countries should look at Japan as a lesson for how do you handle China in the right way. I think the Japanese are right in the sense that they do have something to teach the world about how to handle China. And that way is to not go berserk, not lose your mind about China, but rather seek areas of possible cooperation and mutual benefit while also mitigating and hedging against the risk.
Devin, thanks so much for coming on ChinaTalk.
Thanks a lot, man.
All of my friends legit, you cannot never compete. Drippin', with the size in the shopping. Got me Gucci saga. People ever mother. All the lessons take
Dropping psychedelic な verse Walking on the street 目的探す俺な毎日並ぶ見てみる賞金首さいずれビシファのファミミ更新済みにしたしかしなら用心深くれなますてらい田島派庶民から商人のみ節に這い上がる In the park 俺の具志 and fucking high my god Don't stop I'm not wait and stop Don't stop not wait and stop We don't have a fucking list Kiki Lloyd number parking next Don't stop I'm not wait and stop Don't stop not wait and stop 心臓の飛びハイハイ緊張のカスジャンキーですショッピングリッチサイズにショッピングショッピングリッチサイズにショッピング画面口サガディープウェブまだ俺ら存在感ありすぎ Oh my god コリンビッチとまくるフォーキンショッピングリッチサイズにジャンピング画面口サガディープウェブまだ俺ら存在感ありすぎ Oh my god ポップンピルスアンビシャス激マタンコピペスラッパーなんか物足んないコムベス腰ぬだらけ体内大概しとけサンタバレーの天才のハイライ都合のいいやつ携帯電話ソニーと S 評論家のヘダ嘘情報そのメディアコメンテーターコピペの忍者ムカデのドッペルゲンガーチョッピンリッチサイズにショッピンリッチサイズにショッピン画面口サガディープウェブまだ俺ら存在感ありすぎ Oh my god コリンビッチとまくるフォーキンジョッピンリッチサイズにジャンピン画面口サガディープウェブまだ俺ら存在感ありすぎ Oh my god
めんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしな
メイハーただ単純作業ださいお前らのパイ紙こうすワイ暇ない日に日に困ってるの分かってるの勝手に買ってく気づかずにそうみなし気づかずはめたわなおわけなどなくともほどくなわおそうすべてをなーな大人はなーなーやつはもうなーなーなー決めんだよ雑魚がイラつくぜなーなーなーなー見せてよ先輩目本踊ってよスキルのレベル得意げで見にくいかもガッてく俺らがキルズ
めんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしな
アヤな面簡単な道は歩んでね一緒に住んじゃねてめえらとレベルはるか彼方と驚く報道にキレキレマン忍者調子乗ったバカは転ばすクロスオーバー何がいけてる声だそれは特許の話正しい未来作るキャラマシマシまだ聞いてんの黙れるゼロキラー
めんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしな
じゃあさまあ首に下げたトゥリボケ切れることを知らぬチェイ同じ仲間同じプレイで Get on my way
いやすぐに並ぶキラとフェンディとバダいや金で買えぬことのできぬキラの家族カマファイハナヤンキラホンダオーナダレボめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなタウンティシティメトロポリスディズのビマでマクロポリスベスの海で泳ぐ俺らまるでパリのブラックシェ
めんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしなめんどくせえからどっかでやってろ勝手にやってろしな
先の未来チェック済みとっくに俺見透かすめ何やるにも難しいカスとディスカしねえキラだけで十分で No doubt まだわかんねえならこれでどうで You fucked up 終わりでゲームis over 自分でどうにでもなれる仲間とお前らとの違いは明確だなEDM しか能ないバカハロウィン渋谷田舎もんばっかで疲れるうるせえ帰れ寝てろめんどくせえななんですかって口ばっかのやつが Run this town、ヤンキーだせ近寄んなって俺が言ったからってビビんなめんどくせえからどうかやってろ勝手にやってろ
You should go to fuck home and meditate on this shit, boy. We're living intuitively. Currently knowing the AWC. Oh my, I know you white mafia. 出直して古いサティアン Rappers の目には涙何人が失うのそのキャリア欲しいの全部買う売られてない喧嘩も買う予算管理しなくてもボンスプレッlike a balloon 同じ土俵無理雑魚いその頭ん中熟知 Get a whole team to me 愛ビンビンとへ当然の報いYour boyfriend 惚れ込むこびないエロス腐ったシーンを解毒選ばれし女神のゲノムマジお前誰マジでお前誰 Give me the whole thing man I really know the bitches 乗らないと負け Hey yo check it what it does to me I got anarchy to the left of me I got young killers to the trip of me And I rock the rock to the death of me
街の喧嘩こそダチは前科者見てきたいろんなものシャネルに取りつかれた女の子物が溢れてる影にいいものが隠れてるどれもまがいも売れたらダサくてもいいんじゃないのやるって何マジでやるって何てかお前誰なあお前は誰クールな奴ら 1% もいないんじゃない3つ数えるから泣きやめデニムでも履いてれば足が出る
マジお前誰マジでお前誰 Give me the whole thing man I really know the bitches 乗らないと負け Hey yo check it what it does to me I got anarchy to the left of me I got young killers to the trip of me And I rock the rock to the death of me You can't make me respect you man That shit is earned You used to love me but you now hating That shit is learned You don't know what to feel about me You don't know what you're doing But we're knowing it